Hello, everyone. How are you today? How is your week going? How's life? How is work or school going? Most importantly, how is your dog going? Are they good? Are they happy? If you have not seen this face before, then hi, my name's Liz. It's so nice to meet you. I often sit in this chair and talk about all kinds of things like true crime, weird moments in history, unsolved mysteries. So if that all sounds kind of interesting to you, then please hit subscribe and we can just be the bestest of friends that they ever was, ever, forever, if you want. And if you don't want, because we're best friends now. And if you have seen this face before, then welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back and choosing to voluntarily hang out with me. I really appreciate it. That is so nice of you. Besties, high five. I hope you're having a marvelous week. And she's sitting here thinking I've forgotten about her, but I totally haven't. I, of course, have my supervisor / production manager / real star of the show, Editing Liz. Let's switch to Lilycam. She's all snuggled in and ready to talk unsolved true crime that should have been solved. Okay, so are you guys ready to be mad? Because I know I sit here every week and I'm like, you guys, this case, but seriously, for real this time, you guys, this case, it's ridiculous. Today we are talking about the unsolved murder of the beautiful 20-year-old Anne Zappelli. This is an Australian cold case that took place back in 1969 in the little town of Geraldton in Western Australia. This is probably Geraldton's most notorious unsolved case, and I say unsolved, but really, it's pretty clear who did it. Spoiler alert. There's not a lot of doubt or question here, but even though there was a ton of evidence against him, including a deathbed confession, because of a seriously botched investigation by West Australian police, the man who most likely killed Anne just walked around free for 40 years plus until he died just a few years ago. But I've gotten ahead of myself. Let's rewind back and start this story at the beginning, like a normal person would. Let's begin. Anne Zappelli was born on the 14th of May 1949. She had two brothers and a sister, and they all grew up in the tiny rural town of Morawa, which is roughly a 4-hour drive north of the capital of Western Australia, Perth. At the time, Morawa had a population of about 1,700, and it was just your typical tiny country town where everyone knew everyone and everyone knew everyone's business. Anne was a very popular woman in Morawa. She was really well liked and she stood out from the crowd. Physically, she was dainty, delicate, and petite. And personality-wise, she was very shy, but she had a wicked sense of humor, according to her sister Rhonda. Rhonda, who was 15 at the time that Anne died, said she also remembered that Anne was very tidy, and she was constantly complaining to Rhonda about how messy her side of the room was. When she left school, Anne got a job as a telephonist in Morawa. On the 17th of September 1969, she left for Geraldton, which is about a 2-hour drive towards the coast, with a group of other people to take part in exams that would help her progress in her career. And Anne had another reason for travelling to Geraldton as well. She had made it into the regional judging for Miss Australia. She had raised $1,500 for charity in the lead up to the event, and she was really excited about potentially moving further through the Miss Australia competition. On the 22nd of September, Anne had been in Geraldton for 6 days sitting exams, and she decided it was time to let off some steam. She only had 1 day left of exams, so she and her roommate decided to go to the drive-in, the Oasis drive-in in Wonthella, to see the movie Counterpoint. They invited along a couple of guys, so it was a bit of a double date scenario, which is just so 60s, a double date at the drive-in. Like, I'm living for it. It's just so wholesome. Anne's date that night was a local policeman named Graham Batt, and her roommate's date was Roy Ryan, who was a local school teacher. Roy admitted later that he was also keen on Anne, but had lost out to Graham, so both of the guys were into Anne. The four of them arrived late, about halfway through the movie in fact, and it was a chilly night, so Anne was wearing a white woolen frock and stockings and black shoes. So they arrive about halfway through the film, and Graham said that after a little while, him and Anne started cozying up a little bit of kissing going on, and then Anne all of a sudden at 11 p.m. while the film is still playing says that she's tired and she's going to walk back to the accommodation and turn in for the night. This would have been about a 35-minute walk down the side of a poorly lit highway from the drive-in, which was in the suburb of Wanthella, back to the centre of Geraldton. And her date and the other people in the car said, okay. Geraldton, while a lot bigger than Morawa, was still a small town with a population of around 13,000 people, and its crime rate was pretty minuscule, so there should have been nothing really to worry about. But when the film finished and Anne's friends went looking for her, they couldn't find her anywhere, and Anne never showed up at her accommodation. The three searched for several hours before finally at 8:30 the following morning, they reported Anne as missing to the police. A search ensued, and the following day, on the 24th of September at about 1:25 p.m, Anne's body was found in bushland, about 50 metres off the highway and 1.5 kilometres from the drive-in. The evidence at the crime scene and Anne's autopsy showed that she had put up a fierce and desperate fight against her attacker or attackers before being bashed, raped, and strangled, most likely with her own stockings. This crime absolutely rocked the peaceful town of Geraldton and the surrounding areas. Police put out an appeal to the public to come forward with any information they might have had from that night if anyone had seen Anne, and several eyewitnesses came forward saying that when they had been driving down the highway that night, they saw Anne walking along the road towards town and a car with two men in it following very closely and very slowly behind her. One of the witnesses even said that he had seen the men stop the car, get out and approach Anne. Sadly, all of these witnesses had continued driving. None of them had stopped or pulled over, and this was the last time that Anne was ever seen alive. Suspicion pretty much instantly fell on Anne's date, Graham Batt, and Roy Ryan, the school teacher who also had a romantic interest in Anne. But the men in the car that had been following Anne had been described as one short man and one tall man with a limp. Graham and Roy didn't match this description at all, but that didn't stop them from facing serious rumours and speculation from people in their hometown of Geraldton for years. And I can kind of understand why. Graham had said, as you'll remember, that he and Anne were kissing, and then all of a sudden Anne said she was tired and left. I mean, personally, it feels like there's a little bit more to this story that we're not hearing. Anne leaves before the film finishes and chooses to walk at night back to Geraldton in the cold in an area she wasn't familiar with. I mean, yes, it was regarded as a safe town, but it feels like there had to have been something more to prompt this decision, like maybe a disagreement in the car. But Graham stuck to his story that Anne had said she was tired and left, and this just came completely out of the blue. So police did originally investigate Graham and Roy, but they were both eventually ruled out as suspects, and police instead started looking into another couple of local men. The two men were partners in petty crime, and they also literally lived 1 kilometre from where Anne had been murdered. They matched the description of the men that had last been seen with Anne, and their car matched the description of the car that had been slowly following her. Their names were Norman Raisbeck, who was tall and walked with a limp, and Thomas Craig, who was short and had a history of assaulting girls and young women. Craig had a knack of getting away with his crimes, earning him the nickname the Teflon Man because nothing stuck. But he had been jailed in 1967, just 2 years prior to Anne's murder, for assaulting one of his neighbours, a young woman, with a hammer. Tragically, the woman committed suicide just before Craig had been released from prison. Just to make it even more clear that these two men were the men that police should be after, the night that Anne had been murdered, Raisbeck and Craig fled Geraldton in the middle of the night in their car that matched the description of the car that had been following Anne. 4 days later, they turned up in Adelaide in South Australia, literally on the other side of the country. So these two criminals, one of which had a prior conviction for assaulting a young woman, both matched the description given by eyewitnesses, lived a 10-minute walk from the murder site, and had fled town the night that Anne was murdered. If you're sitting there thinking that this was a pretty open-shut case and was probably solved super quickly, you're wrong. Sorry, I don't like telling people they're wrong, but you're wrong. See, even though Anne's family had been told that the very best detectives that Perth had to offer had been handpicked and brought to Geraldton and were on the case, there were just so many mind-boggling stuff-ups from the very beginning of the investigation. Photographs of the crime scene were incorrectly labelled. Shoe prints and tyre prints were found at the crime scene, but imprints of these were never taken. Fingernail scrapings and swabs of Anne's body were taken, but these were lost before they could be tested. 13 days after Anne's death, the man that was leading up the investigation, Detective Sergeant John Porter, flew to Adelaide to question Thomas Craig and Norman Raisbeck. The men's clothes they had been wearing that night, which might I add had bloodstains on them, were confiscated and then promptly lost. There was no forensic examination completed on the car, and Anne's fingerprints had never been taken, so investigators wouldn't have been able to match her prints with any in or on the car. John Porter must have been a little bit suspicious of the two men because he put them in a cell that had been bugged so that he could listen into their conversation while no one else was around. But Raisbeck and Craig never made any incriminating statements, and Raisbeck's de facto partner came forward with an alibi saying that the men had left Geraldton before Anne's murder. Years later, in 2001, in a coronial inquiry into Anne's death, it would be revealed that Thomas Craig had a suspicion that the cell had been bugged, and he had given Raisbeck the heads up, and that's why they hadn't spoke of Anne's murder in the cell. In the same inquest, Raisbeck's de facto partner would be described as a highly unreliable person whose alibi for the two men should have never been accepted by the police. But John Porter was satisfied with the men's adamant denials of guilt and their story that they had fled Geraldton not because they had murdered Anne, but because they had committed several burglaries that night in Geraldton. Burglaries that they were later extradited back to WA for and jailed. So John Porter ruled the men out as suspects. There were a couple of other local men that police looked into, but in time these were all ruled out as well. In 1970, a prison inmate came forward saying that Thomas Craig had bragged to him about killing Anne, but John Porter said that this inmate was untrustworthy and that his claims were not worth pursuing. And eventually Anne's case went cold. In the meantime, 18 months after Anne was murdered, Thomas Craig was out of jail and staying in the Perth home of the couple Kay and Andy Preedy. Andy was a former associate of Craig's, and the couple were doing him the favour of letting him stay with them while he was on parole. Kay Preedy, who was 18 years old at the time, said they came home after having a couple of drinks at a local hotel, and she was in another room when she heard screams coming from her living room. She rushed in and found Thomas Craig with his hands around a woman's throat, saying, "I'll strangle you like I strangled Anne," with pantyhose. Kay screamed out for her husband Andy, and Andy chased Craig out of the house and down the street. The victim, unfortunately, was so traumatised that she asked the Preedys not to report the incident to the police, and Craig was allowed to disappear. 4 years later, though, Craig was living in another small town in Western Australia called Busselton, and he was back at it again. Craig was driving along one day and pulled up alongside 15-year-old schoolgirl Kate Edwards, who was hitchhiking. Kate accepted the ride from Craig as she recognised him. Busselton was a small place and she had seen him around a few times. Craig drove for a few minutes and then he pulled over, saying to Kate that he needed to get something from the boot to figure out where he was going next. The next time Kate saw Craig, he was on her side of the car outside her door carrying a piece of firewood. He yanked open her door and repeatedly bashed her over the head with the piece of firewood, trying to knock her unconscious. Luckily, Kate was able to shield her head with her arms and Craig eventually gave up. She pleaded with Craig to take her home and swore that she wouldn't tell anyone about the attack, and Craig surprisingly agreed. He dropped her off home, and the second she got inside, she called the police. Craig was charged with assault, but, and I'm sure you saw this coming, the charge didn't stick. The court wasn't allowed to hear of his prior convictions, including the 1967 assault on his neighbour with a hammer. Kate also said in an interview years later that the investigation into her assault was, quote, woefully inadequate. So once again, the Teflon man got away with it. Skipping forward a few years to 1980, after 11 long years of no answers for the grief-stricken Zappelli family, there was a phone call made to a Perth radio station. The caller requested to remain anonymous, but said he had something he wanted to confess, to get off his chest. He said that years ago, he had taken part in a crime in Geraldton, that he and another man had done something terrible. The public went wild. No one knew who this man was, but speculation was rife that it was Norman Raisbeck. That's right, Thomas Craig's partner in crime. Upon hearing of the phone call, police put out a nationwide alert for Raisbeck to track him down, planning on offering him complete immunity if he would testify in court that it was Thomas Craig that murdered Anne. But this plan was halted in its tracks by John Porter. Detective Sergeant John Porter, who had headed up the original investigation into Anne's death, was now Deputy Commissioner and about to be promoted to Police Commissioner. Ronald Whitmore, the detective responsible for the nationwide alert for Raisbeck, was called into John Porter's office. Whitmore had taken a special interest in Anne's case ever since being present in court when Thomas Craig was found not guilty of the assault on the 15-year-old schoolgirl, Kate Edwards. But Porter sat Whitmore down in his office and told him to immediately cease any further inquiries into Anne's case, saying that it had been investigated thoroughly back in 1970 by Porter himself, and didn't Whitmore think it had been done correctly the first time? There are a lot of people, including myself, that think that Porter just didn't want Anne's case reopened and potentially mess with his imminent promotion. And he got his wish because the following year in 1981, he was promoted to police commissioner. He served as commissioner for 4 years before retiring in 1985. And it was 3 years later in 1988 that there was what should have been a groundbreaking development in Anne's case. Police had finally tracked Raisbeck down. He was seriously ill in a hospital in Adelaide, essentially on his deathbed, and he was interviewed by 2 police detectives about Anne's murder. And guys, the things he had to say. Norman Raisbeck said that Thomas Craig was obsessed with Anne, that he was furious that she had chosen to go on a date that night with Graham Batt instead of with him. So when Raisbeck and Craig were cruising around Geraldton that night looking for trouble, and they found Anne walking briskly along the gravel on side of the poorly lit highway, the 2 men seized the opportunity presented before them. Raisbeck told the detectives that he raped Anne first and then returned to the car, at which point Craig raped Anne. When he last saw Anne, Raisbeck said she was alive and Craig had her in a headlock and was dragging her away. When Craig returned to the car with blood on his clothes and scratches on his face, the 2 men agreed to flee to Adelaide and never speak again about what had happened. According to police records, Raisbeck swore to police that everything he had told those 2 detectives was the truth. Norman Raisbeck died in hospital 1 month later. But despite speaking with Raisbeck on 2 separate occasions, police had only taken notes, not a sworn statement. This meant that Raisbeck's deathbed confession was completely useless from a legal standpoint and inadmissible in court. But I mean, are we even surprised at this point? To make matters even worse, the Zappellis weren't even told by police about the confession until 6 years later. Anne's sister Rhonda, when she found out about the confession, was of course furious and demanded that police reopen the case. In 1996, an internal police investigation took place into Anne's case, and I don't know how this was allowed to happen, but John Porter refused to be interviewed, saying he had his reputation to consider, suggesting, of course, that his reputation was more important than finally bringing Anne's killer to justice and allowing her family some peace after 25 years of zero closure. In 2001, the coronial inquest I mentioned earlier took place into Anne's murder, and it was sadly inconclusive. This is because of the over 80 pieces of evidence that had been collected during the investigation. Over half of it had been either lost or destroyed over the years. Coroner Alastair Hope apologised to the Zappelli family, saying that while Raisbeck and Craig should have never been excluded as suspects in the initial investigation, now essentially there simply wasn't enough admissible evidence to bring Thomas Craig to trial. Right up until his death a few years ago, Thomas Craig swore that he had no history of violence against women, that the 1967 hammer attack wasn't him, and that he had been wrongfully convicted. Before he died, he reached out to the Zappelli family, offering to meet with them and share his story, an offer that Rhonda promptly declined. So despite police completing over 9,000 interviews and there being 3 separate inquiries into Anne's death, Anne's case remains unsolved to this day. Rhonda says that Anne would be horrified to know that of her 20 years of life, all there is left to show is a photo of her with a tiara on, carrying a bouquet of flowers. But sadly, that's what Anne has become, a 20-year-old beauty queen, frozen in time, iconised in perfection by the public, only really remembered for her beauty and her tragic death, not for who she was at her core as a person. And that is the end of today's video. I'm sure some of you are feeling a little bit heated, a little bit angry for Anne. Me too. So offload, tell me about how you're feeling about Anne's case in the comments down below. I love hearing from you guys. I seriously geek out anytime one of you leaves a comment on one of my videos. It just makes me so happy. It's the best. Of course, Lily wants to say bye. Lily, you gonna come over and say bye to your friends? Yeah, you're gonna say bye to your friends? Oh, what's wrong? Are you hungry? I fed you this morning. It's literally like midday. Sass. So thank you for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to hit like. I hope you just have a splendid week. I've got to go feed my dog, so I will see you next time. Bye.